Hello and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching vSphere Replication, replicating and recovering virtual machines. In another lesson, I introduced the new vSphere 5.1 replication feature. I covered how to download it and how to install the vSphere Replication virtual appliance. In this lesson, I'll walk you through the process of replicating a vSphere virtual machine and then recovering a vSphere virtual machine that has been replicated using vSphere 5.1 replication. So with that, let's get started. According to VMware, vSphere Replication is the only true hypervisor-level replication solution available today. There are, of course, a number of vSphere replication solutions available from third parties, but VMware says that their solution, again, is the only true hypervisor-level replication available. It's also the only replication solution available from VMware. How it works is it replicates just the blocks that have changed in each of the virtual machine's virtual disk files. It can support up to 500 virtual machines, so it may or may not be a solution for a large enterprise. And you can create the virtual machine seeds, which is the initial virtual machine replication done for each new virtual machine that's replicated in a variety of different ways. Of course, that virtual machine seed, or that first replicated copy of the virtual machine, is going to be very large as compared to just the changed blocks that would be replicated later. Thus, those virtual machine seeds can be done, of course, over the network, which could take a while, or you have other options, such as copying the virtual machines to, let's say, a USB external hard drive, and driving them over to the disaster recovery data center, where you copy them onto the vSphere 5.1 host in order to create the virtual machine seed. vSphere 5.1 replication does have a handful of limitations. For example, there's no automated failback method. Once you recover a virtual machine, there's no way to really go back to the previous version that was running on the host that, let's say, failed and caused you to perform the recovery. Another limitation is that the minimum RPO, or the recovery point objective, is going to be 15 minutes. That means that at maximum, you would lose up to 15 minutes of virtual machine data or changed blocks should you have to recover a virtual machine using vSphere replication. For some companies, that's going to be just fine. However, for other companies with mission-critical Tier 1 applications, a 15-minute RPO may not be acceptable, and at that case, they need to look at higher-end, most likely much more expensive replication solutions. Some other limitations are that there's no support for VMware fault tolerance, VMware's linked clone feature, virtual machine templates cannot be replicated, and of course virtual machines that have physical RDMs or raw device mappings, those RDMs would not be replicated with vSphere replication. So at this point, let's go over to our vSphere lab, where we've already installed the vSphere replication virtual appliances and performed the basic configuration, and let's start replicating virtual machines. Here we are at the primary site of the Wired Brain Coffee Company. We've got a primary data center here at Hilton Head, South Carolina, and they have just a single ESX host at this point, at least in this virtual lab environment. And then, of course, we've got a secondary site over in Dallas, Texas, as you can see here, and it's managed by a different vCenter server. This is the vCenter server virtual appliance, as opposed to the Windows edition being used at the primary data center. Again, they just have a single ESXi host at this data center and just a handful of virtual machines. In our previous lesson, we downloaded and deployed the vSphere replication appliance at each of these two different data centers. So at this point, I want to walk you through the process of actually replicating a virtual machine. And to demonstrate that, I've actually already replicated a virtual machine that I can show you as an example before we perform our replication. So here I am at the secondary site. We've got the vSphere replication inventory. If I go into that and then into the sites, we're here on the secondary site, and on the secondary site, I've replicated this Windows 2012 server. You can see the status here is OK. That means the replication has succeeded, and the periodic updates from one site to the other have been occurring successfully as well. We see the target here is the primary data center, so this virtual machine is actually being replicated backwards, I guess you could say, from the secondary site to the primary site. But my point in demonstrating this is that the replications don't have to be just one way. You could do two-way replications of different virtual machines. So the data centers don't have to be primary and secondary. They could be data center A and data center B and data center C, and you could perform replications in whatever direction you want from one data center to the other. What I'm trying to say is that these data centers could be peer data centers. They could be equal data centers. They don't have to be primary and secondary in the traditional failover scenario. We can see the replication size of the changes have been about 50 megabytes here, and our RPO is every 24 hours. So we're just replicating virtual machine changes every 24 hours. This virtual machine is able to use Microsoft Shadow Copy Services, or VSS, to quiesce the guest operating system to ensure that the replications that occur are application consistent and have data integrity. If we select this virtual machine, we get some options up here, and I can go in and I can reconfigure the replication. So you can see exactly what we're doing here. We're replicating from the secondary site to a local data store at the primary data center. I'll click Next here, and I'll go through this relatively quickly because I'm going to be doing this in much more detail in just a second. Here you can see that disk replication is enabled, and the virtual machine is currently using thin provisioning, and we're opting to use the same format as the source. I'll just click Next here because I wanted to show you on this virtual machine the guest OS quiescing option. What happens when you quiesce the guest operating system, just as you could do on the backup of a virtual machine using a backup application, is that the operating system is momentarily paused to ensure that the application has time to write any data changes before the changes are captured to the virtual machine disk file. This is to ensure that the application data is consistent, so that when you bring this virtual machine back up and you recover this virtual machine after a disaster has occurred, the application data in, let's say, an Exchange database or a Microsoft SQL database is not corrupt. That way you don't have to rebuild the database or perform some application integrity checks to get the database back up and running. You don't want to have to go through those types of problems when a disaster has occurred. You want to get that virtual machine back up and running as quickly as possible. So with virtual machines that have applications such as the ones I mentioned, it's best practice to use Microsoft Shadow Copy Services, or VSS, to ensure that the guest operating system is quiesced when the changes to the virtual machine disk file are captured. Now keep in mind, as it says here, that quiescing the guest operating system may take several minutes and may affect the RPO times. In other words, by quiescing the guest operating system, there could be some application latency or application pauses even during that time. And if you're quiescing the guest operating system and it takes a few minutes, that could actually affect the recovery point objectives if those RPOs are set very low. So in just a few minutes, when I configure a new replication job for a virtual machine, I'll go into more details on the RPO, the target location, the hard disk configuration, and so forth. But I'll tell you ahead of time, that virtual machine that I'll be replicating doesn't have the right virtual machine hardware version, nor does it have the VMware tools installed, so we won't be able to configure guest operating system quiescing. And that's why I wanted to demonstrate that for you on this virtual machine, this Windows 2012 server that is already being replicated and is using guest operating system quiescing with Microsoft Volume Shadow Copy. So again, we're here at the secondary site. We have outgoing replications. We don't have any incoming replications. That's what we're about to configure. So let's go back to the primary site and get started creating a new replication job using vSphere 5.1 replication. Here we are at the primary site of the Wired Brain Coffee Company, and the virtual machine that we'll be configuring replication on is this virtual machine right here, WBC-prod-web server. This is the production web server for the Wired Brain Coffee Company, and if we actually go to the web page of the web server, this is actually a virtual appliance that I downloaded from the web. It's a WordPress virtual appliance, But as you can see here, it is a real working web server. I can access my application here. And there's the WordPress blog. Everything does work. It's a real working web server. The reason I selected this web server for replication, to be honest with you, is it's small. It's a working virtual machine, but it's very small. Notice here that the storage used by this virtual machine is just 3 gigabytes. So that won't take very long to replicate over the network, and I can demonstrate vSphere replication for you here very quickly using this virtual machine. Now, to replicate a virtual machine, you might think that you would go into Home and then to vSphere Replication and then into Sites and maybe select your site and then find your virtual machine. However, that's not the case. Here we see the status of our replication on the Summary tab. We can monitor incoming and outgoing replications and any issues related to replication. We can also manage the sites that we're connected to. In this case, we just have a primary and a secondary data center, and we can see we're successfully connected to the secondary site. But this is not where you go to replicate virtual machines. To replicate virtual machines, you select the virtual machines on a case-by-case basis, or a virtual machine by virtual machine basis. So what I need to do is to go to the home screen and then either into hosts and clusters or virtual machines and templates, and then actually select the virtual machine that you want to replicate. From here, you can right-click on the virtual machine and go down to All vSphere Replication Actions, which you'll know you have successfully configured replication, or one of the things that will alert you is that you have this new option on your virtual machines. So you can go in here to configure replication. You can also, of course, go up here to the Actions drop-down on the virtual machine, and then down to the same option, All vSphere Replication Actions. So I'll click here to configure replication, and this brings up a nice wizard that walks you through the process. So first we're asked for the target site. Where is it that we want to send this replication? So again, it doesn't have to be just a primary and secondary site. You can have data center A, B, and C and replicate from one to the other to the other. In this case, I configured the more traditional primary and secondary configuration. So we'll be replicating to the secondary site. Notice that validation succeeded here. And if you have a site that you haven't set up yet, you can go here to add the remote site. I'll just click Next. And now we're given the source location of the virtual machine. And let's replicate it to the storage area network at the secondary site. Notice again that validation succeeded. If we want to perform some more advanced disk configuration, we can check the box here, which will allow us to tweak exactly which hard disk we want to be replicated. In the case of this virtual machine, there's just one hard disk, and I wasn't going to change anything about that hard disk, but we'll go ahead and check it. So we can click Next here, and you can see the more advanced configuration. So here we're checking to enable disk replication. That's definitely something we want to do to replicate the virtual machine disk files. We can see the source location, the source disk size, the type of the source disk. We could actually change the disk type to either thick or thin provisioning during the replication process. And if we had multiple hard disks on this virtual machine, you would have other options here, hard disk 1, hard disk 2, hard disk 3, where you could individually configure those hard disks to be either replicated or not replicated, to change the virtual disk format, and to select the location where you want that individual virtual hard disk to be replicated to. So that's the benefit to choosing the advanced option. You get a configuration screen for each of the different virtual hard disks that are configured for a particular virtual machine. Now, validation did succeed here, so I'll just click Next. And let's talk a little bit about the RPO, or the Recovery Point Objective. So the Recovery Point Objective is how often you want the changes to the virtual machine's disk file to be sent to the remote site or to the target site. So let's say that we had a very critical virtual machine and we wanted it replicated as often as possible. I could move the slider here all the way over to just 15 minutes, and every 15 minutes the changes to the virtual machine disk file would be collected, and those changes would be shipped across to the secondary site. Now, if we had a less critical virtual machine, we can move this slider all the way over to 24 hours and just replicate that virtual machine's changes every 24 hours. It's totally up to you, and you're making this selection on a per virtual machine basis. If you want more advanced disaster recovery solutions where you can configure virtual machine replication in mass and configure recovery point objectives, in mass across all your virtual machines, then I recommend you look at VMware Site Recovery Manager or a third-party solution. That's because vSphere replication is configured completely on a per virtual machine basis. So in the case of this virtual machine, this is the most critical web server that the Wired Brain Coffee Company has. So we're going to move the slider all the way over to every 15 minutes. Now keep in mind, if you're replicating the virtual machine disk file changes every 15 minutes, the network connection between the primary and the secondary site, in this case, needs to be able to keep up with the volume of changes that are occurring to the virtual machine disk file. So if you had a database server that had a high volume or high rate of change on the virtual machine disk file, and you're trying to replicate that every 15 minutes over, let's say, a lower bandwidth connection, you might get to the point where the vSphere replication appliances just cannot keep up with the rate of change to the virtual machine disk file over a relatively low bandwidth link, and you have to actually increase the RPO time to something that will allow those changes to be sent down that network path to the secondary site within the 4-hour recovery point objective window. Moving on, we talked about the guest operating system quiescing, and I mentioned that this virtual machine doesn't have the VMware tools installed, so you won't be able to configure guest operating system quiescing on this particular virtual machine. We've already discussed that in detail, so let's move on. And here we get a ready to complete screen where we get to review what we're about to do. Everything looks good there, so let's go ahead and click finish. And then to check the status of our virtual machine replication, we'll go up to the home screen and then into the vSphere replication inventory. We'll go into sites, into the primary site, and to the monitor tab. On the monitor tab, we can check our outgoing replications, and we can see that currently we're replicating the WBC prod web server. The initial full replication is currently happening. It's going to the secondary site. We don't have any more information here other than the RPO and that guest quiescing is not being used. Here we can actually select the virtual machine, and we have options to pause the replication, to permanently stop the replication, and this is where you could actually recover the virtual machine once the replication has occurred successfully. In our case, I made a mistake actually here. You notice it says 4 hours and 15 minutes is the RPO. All we need to do to change that, I thought it was the default of 4 hours. So let's select this. Let's go up here to reconfigure replication. We'll click next, next, and let's change this to just 4 hours. So I'll type in a 0 there. I'll click next and finish. So we just modified the virtual machine replication. Notice it says now 4 hours. So it'll take a few minutes for this replication to occur, even though, as we said, this virtual machine's disk file is relatively small, just about 3 gigabytes. What I'll do is I'll pause the recording, and I'll be right back as soon as this is complete. All right, it looks like our replication has completed successfully. We see the status here is OK, so everything looks good. Let's go to the secondary site. And if we check the monitoring tab, the incoming replication section at the secondary data center, we can see again for this virtual machine, we have an OK for the replication status. So everything looks good. With that, let's go back to our slides and let's learn a little bit more about recovering virtual machines. Now, one of my goals of this lesson on vSphere replication is to make it look easy, to see how easy it really can be. But I also want to give you a word of caution, which is disaster recovery is a very critical piece of your data center infrastructure and the role of IT at your company. And the applications and data inside your virtual machines are critical to your company. So I don't want you to think that vSphere replication is just something that you don't even have to think about, you can do in just a few clicks. It can be a complex process if you have many virtual machines, you have multiple sites. You'll need to learn about your applications. You'll need to consider the RPO for each of your virtual machines. So one of the things I recommend that you do is to go read the vSphere administration guide from VMware. It has a lot more detail than what I can provide you in these video training lessons. You can find it at vmware.com in the support and documentation section. This is what it looks like. Now that you're aware of this guide for reference, let's go over to our vSphere virtual infrastructure and let's actually recover a virtual machine using vSphere 5.1 and the vSphere replication feature. Okay, we're back at the primary data center, the primary site for the Wired Brain Coffee Company. If I go into the home screen and into hosts and clusters, let's just say that there is a problem with this web server. You've got a new junior admin, he goes in here, he powers down the virtual machine accidentally, and in doing so there's some corruption of the data. So how do we get this virtual machine back to its last replicated status? Let's go over to the secondary site, and here on the secondary site we've got the virtual machine, the status is still good. All we have to do is select this virtual machine. We can go up here to the toolbar where it says Recover Replicated Virtual Machine, or we can right-click on the virtual machine and go down and just click Recover. We need to enter the credentials for the primary site, assuming the primary site is up. In this case, I'll enter the administrative credentials. It connects to the primary site and queries the vCenter server, and here we have two options to select from. The first one is, do we recover this virtual machine with the recent changes? What that means is that a synchronization will first occur. Or do we recover this virtual machine with the latest available data? You would use this option if the source virtual machine's disks are corrupt. And what that means is no data synchronization is performed from the primary site to the secondary site before you recover it. So what we'll choose is the second option here because we know there was likely some corruption at the primary site. We'll click Next. We need to select where we want to recover this virtual machine. We're going to put it in the Dallas, Texas Virtual Data Center. This is the secondary site that we're on, and we're recovering this virtual machine at the secondary site. I want to be clear about that. We're not going to be putting it back on the primary site. It's coming up at the secondary site because some corruption, some disaster has occurred at the primary site. We'll click Next here. We'll select the host that we want to recover this virtual machine on. Validation succeeded. We'll click Next. And now we're ready to recover this virtual machine using vSphere replication. Notice it says that the virtual machine will be recovered with the network devices disconnected. This is to ensure that you don't have some conflict on the network after you perform the recovery. We're also powering on the virtual machine. And it says it will be using the latest available replication data on the target site, and no synchronization will be performed first from the primary site. That's because in this scenario we said the primary site has some corruption. So we'll just click Finish here. And then let's go to Sites, and we'll go all the way up to the home screen, then into Virtual Machines and Templates. And notice here we're still at the secondary site, and take a look at this. Before I could even get over here, we've got a new virtual machine that's been recovered. The Wired Brain Coffee production web server has been recovered. Let's go ahead and click to launch the console. We're currently powering up the virtual machine. It says it's waiting for the network configuration. I'll tell you why it's waiting for the network configuration. That's because the virtual machine network adapter is disconnected. If we go into Edit Settings, I know that the primary virtual machine has been powered off, so we won't have any conflicts. Let's go ahead and connect that network adapter. I'll say OK. the virtual machine is reconfigured. If we launch the console again, and the virtual machine has booted up, it has an IP address, the network is now connected. Let's go ahead and access the web page using that IP address. As you can see, it looks like we've got a fully functioning production web server for the Wired Brain Coffee Company. I can go into the WordPress functionality here. I can click on the comments. Everything looks like it's working as it should. And that tells me that the replication of our virtual machine from one site to the other and the recovery of that virtual machine using vSphere replication was successful. And that brings us to the end of this lesson covering vSphere replication, where I walked you through the process of replicating virtual machines and then testing the recovery of those virtual machines. I'm really impressed with all that vSphere replication does, especially since it's included free with vSphere starting with the Essentials Plus Edition and above. Again, thanks for watching this lesson covering vSphere replication.